Hello everyone and welcome to an introduction to World Creator 2. I'm Tyler, and in this video we are going to go over World Creator 2's user interface to get you acclimated a bit before we start creating our terrain. Once you have World Creator 2 launched, you will see the UI is split up into three different zones. On the left we have the quick toolbar, the center is the viewport that we'll be mostly working out of, and the properties panel on the right, and we'll be spending most of our time breaking down the properties panel throughout this series. Starting on the left, we have the quick toolbar. Now, the quick toolbar is your fast track items to hide or unhide different elements to the terrain, such as terrain effects or the ocean or objects. We will dive into these further as we move forward, but the first thing to note in the quick toolbar is your typical starting point to create a new project or open a previous one, as well as your save and save as options, as you can see at the very top here. And if you hover your mouse over one of the icons in the quick toolbar, it'll display the text as to what this icon is called. The first few are your typicals, as we talked about, and we will break down each one of these as the tutorial series goes on. But the one icon I would like to point attention to first really is this one right here that's called the Observer Tools. Clicking this will bring up some information here in the top left. Now, I like to keep this icon on at all times as it gives me some on-screen information about the terrain we have, as well as some coordinates and elevation data based on where my cursor is over the terrain or in the viewport. So for example, as I move my cursor along here, you will see the elevation data as well as the distance data of my mouse change dynamically. If we want to see what the highest peak in our terrain here is, if we go under here and see the min and max, the max represents the highest point in meters on the terrain, and the min obviously represents the low. The range represents the distance between the min and max, because this is some information that you will want to know, especially whenever you go to exporting this into some third-party application like Unity or Unreal Engine, just in case you want to keep this to scale. You don't have to, but it's up to you. While we're already here, the center portion of our program is the viewport window. This houses all the visuals of our terrain and primarily the viewport that will be working graphically in World Creator 2. To navigate, we can simply scroll inward or outward with the middle mouse wheel, and that'll give us a zoom in or zoom out feature. If we were to press and hold on the middle mouse button while dragging the mouse around, that is going to pan the view of the terrain around. Now, if we were to press and hold the right mouse button and move the mouse around, we will rotate our view around the terrain. If you want to reorient yourself back to the home base view, as I like to call it, all you have to do is just press F, and your view will snap back to the overall view or the original view of your terrain. In the top right of the viewport is a gizmo icon right up here. This primarily shows you the directionality of the terrain based on your camera. If we were to rotate our view around the terrain just a little bit, you will see that the gizmo icon also rotates based on the orientation that your terrain is being displayed on the viewport. This gizmo also gives us the feature to do some quick views based on our angle. So if we were to click on the top axis here, which is represented in green, the view in our viewport will snap to the top-down view of the terrain. Similarly, if we were to select the right axis or the x-axis here and pan our terrain around, we can get a full view of the right side of our terrain. This is a pretty quick way to jump around the terrain just a little bit to give you a better view if you want an orthographic or perspective view. We can also change how the viewport looks or renders the scene from the properties panel, but I'll show you where we can do that later on in just a minute. So the properties panel here on the right is the main muscle to World Creator 2. It is where we will be establishing all of our design elements, materials, and objects from. The properties panel is made up of 8 main sections, which we can be seen here at the top. The surface section is where the main modeling and features of the terrain is located. The texture section is where we will go to texture all aspects of the terrain. The scene section has to do with adding external objects or models, as well as the on-screen rendering of the viewport. The areas section is where we will go to control any masking or sculpting of the first 3 sections. And the post section houses all the simulations in World Creator 2, such as flood simulations. The next 3 sections are sort of your utility sections. The media library houses all the assets you have not only in your project, but houses the library to the assets that you have in your World Creator 2 folder that I'll share when we get to that point. And the export section is where we will go to custom export our terrain to any third-party applications such as Unity, Unreal Engine, Lumberyard, Maya, Blender, you name it. And finally, the options section houses all the settings for the application itself. Each of these main sections have subsections to further categorize what you are wanting to achieve. For example, in the service section here, our starting area is the base tab. And the base tab is where we begin defining the shape, rules, and boundaries of our starting terrain. The filters tab is where we'll define what generators affect the form of the terrain, such as creating a plateau or adding erosion. Here are all the special ingredients to creating the very fundamentals of your environment. I'll be sure to cover each section and subsection in their entirety once we need them in the series. For now, let's continue with the rest of the interface. Next, let's take a look at our 3 utility tabs in the top right. First up is the Media tab right here. Let's go ahead and just click this. It is comprised of 3 sections, the Texture section, Meshes, and Details, which basically just establishes the type of media that we're wanting to search. We also have the ability to search between our local library, where the main World Creator 2 asset library is located, or we can select Project, which will house all the assets that we have associated with our project here. Now, when you first install World Creator 2, it would be a great idea to establish where you want your local library to be located at on your computer. This is the main World Creator 2 local library that houses all of the starting assets or the assets that you decide to add on your own. By default, the library, along with the bridge tool and any screenshots you take, will be located within the World Creator 2 folder inside your My Documents folder. However, you can place the library anywhere you want, provided you've set up the library's subfolder paths correctly. By that, I mean if I had created a brand new World Creator folder here, as you can see in my projects and libraries, I've created a new folder called World Creator. If I wanted to instead have all of the downloaded assets that come with the software install here instead of My Documents, then we need to make sure that our subfolders here are set up correctly. You can do that by selecting the library from the original World Creator folder and basically just creating new folders that are named exactly like this. So if we were to go over here, select a new folder, and then type in each one accordingly, as well as any subfolder underneath these Details, Meshes, and Textures folders. So for example, under Textures, we need to make a new folder called Gradients, Ground, LUT, and Sky within our new folder here. It can seem like a weird process at first, but if you need to install the library onto an external or a different hard drive altogether, this would be the way to do it instead of loading everything up on your My Documents. Once you are satisfied with where you want to house all of your assets, all you have to do now is just select the World Creator folder that you've either created or select the one that's in your My Documents folder that was automatically created when you installed the software. For this series, I'm going to select the World Creator folder that I just created to showcase this process. So we have the World Creator folder selected, and we're just going to click OK. And then it's going to say no World Creator assets were found. That's all right. So we just need to download the assets, and you can see here it's got the correct library folder selected that I've made. So let's go ahead and select download assets. So now that the assets have been downloaded, we have to then select apply assets. Now, basically all we downloaded was the zip files directly from World Creator. So applying assets is just going to unzip those correctly in the folder structure. So let's go ahead and click that. And now we're good. And if all goes well, you should be able to see all the directories here that are part of our library. If we go to project, you can see we do not have anything in our project. It is all in our library. So back in our library, if we were to select ground, for example, select the World Creator directory, and you can see all the assets that have come free with your World Creator purchase. The next utility we have up here is the Export tab. Now, the Export tab section is intended for all of those who want to customize your exports. We will dive into this in much greater detail later on, but in essence, the surface section here is where you get to define all the export options for your height map or the physical aspect of the terrain. We could then specify any type of textures that we want to export as a whole, so any type of splat map, color map, distribution map. We can specify any type of format for that. Same thing, if we have a water simulation, we can export a flow map or an erosion map, and our heat maps or our alpha maps to establish any type of masking that we want to export and use in other engines. At the end of the series, when we go to export our terrain, I'll be sure to cover this section in much further detail. And our last utility tab, which could be one of the most important ones, is the settings tab, or in this case, the options icon. And that's the one that looks like the little gear icon here in the top right. Now, the first subcategory for options is the general area, and this is where we will begin to setting up our first optimization options. Under the application settings here right in the middle, here's one that you would probably want to keep an eye out for straight up. It's the limit frame rate and target frame rate. These settings here could help you control the performance of your GPU on screen. If you're having a struggling GPU, I recommend setting the target frame rate here down to something about 30 FPS, perhaps 20 FPS if you're on a really struggling GPU. If you're on something really good like a 2080 or 2080 Ti and you want a fairly smooth experience, then you can set this to 60. If you do not want to limit your frame rate, just uncheck limit frame rate and World Creator will run as fast as your GPU will allow it. I like to keep mine at no more than 60 because I'm not moving terribly fast, and limiting it to 60 FPS will help the GPU run just a little bit better. The next setting in this area is arguably one of the biggest performance savers, and I always enable this no matter what the GPU you have, is the multi-frame generation. So I'm going to go ahead and just check this. And when I did that, you can see that a little progress bar down here in the bottom has appeared, and you will see this move off and on anytime you do any type of change to your terrain. So what exactly is multi-frame generation? Well, instead of the generation taking place on the terrain in absolute real time, which is fantastic, when it does, it's essentially doing the entire change in one frame. So if you have a lot going on, forcing World Creator 2 to adjust all those changes in one frame is a lot of headache. So what you can do is by turning on multi-frame generation, you can have the workload of the generation process be spread across multiple frames instead of just one. So for example, if I increase the workload per frame to about 50%, that's basically saying 50% of the workload is happening in one frame and the other 50% is happening in the next frame. I'm just going to drop mine down to 0%. That way World Creator can establish as much of the workload per frame for me as possible, so it's a little bit more real time for you. A few other settings in this application section. Up at the top, we have the mannequin type, whether it's female or male. If you want to see your mannequin, just scroll pretty closely to your terrain, and wherever your mouse icon is, just press H, and your mannequin will appear pretty nicely. If you want to hide or unhide your mannequin, you can just toggle it here on the toggle mannequin icon here on the left quick toolbar. And if you want to change the location of your mannequin, just go ahead and press H anywhere else on the terrain. You have an autosave feature, and you can establish how often you want it to be saved. This could be pretty handy for those who are the forgetful type and don't manage to click that Control S ever so often. I don't like to do that. I like to keep my autosave off because I'm pretty good about saving. And sometimes if you have a pretty intense terrain going on, the autosave will initiate no matter what you're doing and can interrupt your process, especially if you're running a simulation. So for me, I like to keep autosave off, but you may want it on. It's completely up to you. And then the last thing in this little area is the tooltips checkbox. Now the tooltips checkbox basically just hides or unhides the annotations that let you know what something is. For example, if I hover over the surface tab, it's going to tell me in the text form there that it says surface. But if we uncheck tooltips and we hover over that icon, it doesn't tell us what it is. I think it's a good thing to keep this on, and at least until you become really familiar with the program, and it'll help you learn what the icons and buttons are here and there. And lastly, you have your screenshot settings, which lets you apply the World Creator logo anytime you make a screenshot, as well as the size of that screenshot if you decide to do a supersize screenshot. So if you want to press F10, that will initiate full screen mode. If you press F11, that will take a regular screenshot. Now, a regular screenshot will be the resolution of your display or the resolution that you've established World Creator to be. If you select F12, that will take a supersize screenshot, and the supersized screenshot resolution is established right here. It's basically a percentage value that you're increasing your regular percentage rate. To see where your screenshots go on your hard drive, they are in your My Documents folder and the World Creator folder. You will see a screenshots subfolder inside of here, and this is the default location where all of your screenshots that you take will be located. The next settings tab we have here is the graphics section. So just like in most games, we have a quick property selection to choose between low, medium, high, and ultra graphic quality presets. Now these settings will not change the quality of the terrain generation itself, but does change the way graphics are displayed within your viewport. If we were to select the low quality, for example, you see that most of everything gets turned off, while if we were to select ultra, mostly everything gets turned back on. This is a really quick way to get an idea of what each quality is going to be like at each different setting based on the performance of your own computer. Let's go ahead and click Ultra here so that we can see what's mostly being affected. So the first set of options you have here at the very top is most likely going to be the most adjustable at each preset and can result in the largest outcome. So if we were to adjust the terrain quality here, it's going to adjust the tessellation and detail of the terrain, while the max detail density adjusts how many things like trees and grass and shrubs and rocks appear on the terrain at different densities. Ray marching, we'll cover this a little bit later on when we do rendering, but it's essentially the prelude to ray tracing. The next thing you have is the max terrain resolution. Now you can technically make any size terrain that you want, but World Creator 2 has established that right here 16K is the max resolution that is going to be displayed on the terrain. You can make a terrain that's 50K by 50K, but to perform well enough and actually design the terrain, it's establishing a maximum of 16K as the workable terrain resolution, though you can easily export the terrain at any resolution. The next section here is the shadow section. Now, shadows are great to have primarily for giving you depth to the terrain while you edit or when it comes to rendering. At best, I would set the shadow resolution to something like medium instead of ultra here while you model, and if you render from World Creator 2, then pump that resolution back up to ultra so that you can get a really nice resolution in your shadows for your final render. Another thing to keep in mind with the shadows is the type of shadows. By default, when we selected Ultra, the type of shadows is the hard and soft section here. If you want to turn shadows completely off, then you can see here it turns shadows completely off. The hard only section creates a really harsh edge here, and that's okay for modeling purposes because from this perspective in the back, you can't really see the feathering of the edge of the shadow very well. At least until when you zoom in and you want this edge here to be a little soft, then you would select hard and soft shadows, and you can see that it has feathered the edge here just a little bit. Another thing to keep in mind with the hard and soft shadows is the shadow cascade amount. Let's go ahead and select the shadow type of hard only so that we can see this effect take place a little bit easier. So right now we have a shadow cascade of 4. If we were to select 2, you can see how much more rough this gets. Or if we select none, then it will not cascade at all and it gets even less density there in your shadows. If we go back to hard and soft, you can see that no cascade produces something that's really soft. 2 cascades gets a little bit more softer and defined based on the terrain, and 4 cascades does the exact shape of the terrain that we saw previously with that feathered edge. So cascades are pretty much the number of steps that the shadow is taking place to render the tessellated terrain out. If you select no cascades, then it's going to select the bare minimum of shadow projection off of the terrain. It's not a whole lot to worry about, but if you're wanting to do a final render, it's something that you should need to know. For modeling purposes, I would almost select the shadow resolution down to medium and maybe the cascades to 2 so that our performance is just a little bit better. And lastly, the shadow terrain quality just further defines a little bit more minute detail in that shadow. Running further down the line here, we have the anisotropic textures, which refers to how textures look at oblique angles. So I keep this off unless you are rendering or taking screenshots within World Creator 2. Reflections just enables or disables surface reflections. If you have a really good GPU, you can leave this one on, otherwise I would turn it off unless you are rendering screenshots within the application. Next, we have HDR, high dynamic range, and this is only applicable if you have an HDR monitor and want to enable this feature. It's just a coloring feature and you don't really have to have it, and it won't hinder performance per se, but if you do not have an HDR compatible monitor, then you may want to just go ahead and turn this off. Then there is the camera motion blur setting, and to showcase this, I'm gonna zoom in out here, and I don't know if you can see the motion blur or when I do this, There is a little bit of motion blur when I move the terrain or move the camera around. I almost always keep this turned off because adding motion blur is just a little bit dizzy and daunting to the terrain creating process. And by having it turned off though is going to increase your performance just a tad. So I would just keep it off, especially while you're modeling and designing your terrain. And lastly, there is the anti-aliasing option. You can turn it off completely, or you have the option to select between TAA or FXAA. This will essentially add anti-aliasing to the entire viewport, and I just keep mine to the default preset that you can see here. It's going to smooth out any jagged edges that you may see, and it's completely up to you if you want. Or if you're modeling, you can simply just turn this off and increase performance quite drastically. The easiest thing I would recommend with this is to stick with one of the 4 quick presets here at the top between low or ultra. But if you're someone who likes to tinker around and you need a little help knowing what's what, if you were to look here on each one of these sections, there's a question mark, and that question mark is result to, as you can see, the documentation. If we click this, we can open a new window here on the top left, which is the in-application documentation for everything. If we were to scroll through this, it'll explain and give some tips and tricks on some things to change or alter to give you the best results. It'll explain what each thing is and how it affects your view or your terrain. Also, if we were to go up here to the top right to the About subsection here and select that, and if you want to select on the Help Center right here, this is going to bring up a web page where the Help Center is, and this is where you can get some extra information such as how-tos, the full PDF documentations, installation guides, some get started information, as well as all of the release notes for any version that you may have. So it's a good resource to go in, ask questions, and get some information about each little piece of the program. Back to our utility tab here, let's click on the next section, which is the camera section. Now, I don't mess with the camera too much, but this adjusts the options of the viewport camera itself. One thing I do change, the distance dependent speed basically adjusts the rate at which your camera moves in and out of the terrain when you use the WASD keys. So for example, if I were to hold down W, the camera is moving forward at a set pace. Now, if this is too slow, then you just select distance dependent speed. Then you can adjust the multiplier to adjust how fast or slow the camera moves in and out using the WASD keys. You can even adjust the field of view to be something much shorter or further away for just like you would in games. I'm just going to hit the back arrow key here to reset our defaults and go back to the original field of view that I want, as well as the other sensitivity settings. And almost always, the one thing I really like to do is change the near clipping plane and the far clipping plane. This is going to establish when the terrain clips in the camera view based on distance in meters. So if I were to keep zooming out, we will eventually see our terrain start to disappear. You can see it disappears right there, and that means that plane right there is 8,000 meters out. If we were to increase this, you can see that our terrain is starting to come back into view because I'm adding more distance to our camera. Same thing for the near clip plane. If we were to zoom in much further, by it being at 0.1 means we have to get really close for it to cut our plane. But let's go ahead and increase this to something right there, and we zoom in, you can see that the terrain is being clipped by the near clip plane. Let's just go ahead and reset our defaults again, press F to reorient our view, and now we're all back to normal. And the very last tab that we'll quickly look at before we end this video is the interface tab. Now, the interface section is all about customizing the colors of World Creator 2's user interface. It takes a bit of trial and error to find what you're after because you're literally changing every aspect to the UI. But if you spend some time and tweak it to your liking, it could be really nice to have something that's customized to just you. One thing at the top that's really nice is the UI scale. So we select our scale and we can change it to any number percentage based on our monitor's resolution. I have a 4K monitor, so if I select the scale of 100, then the UI is going to get really tiny because it's being proportionally displayed based on the resolution of my 4K monitor. If I want to select scale 200, then this would be the UI size for something like a 1080p monitor. For me, I like to be around at least 150 when I do my work, but for the remainder of the tutorial, I'm going to choose 175 so that we can see some of the detail a little bit easier for you guys. And after you've gone through the process of customizing these colors any way you want, if you want to do that, you can go up here under the scale and select save, and you can save this anywhere on your computer in case you want to back up what you've done. I myself have my own UI color scheme that I much prefer than the default, so if you want to see that or know how to get that, then I'll see you over onto the next World Creator 2 Extras video where I'll break that down a little bit further. Well, everyone, that pretty much covers the basic overview to World Creator 2's user interface. Again, I'll be breaking down each tab or section as we go along through this series. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.